Imagine for a moment a machine that grips the road not because of its weight, but because the very air around it is working silently and violently to hold it down. This is the story of ground effect, perhaps the most elegant and the most dangerous idea in the history of Formula One. To understand it, we must begin not on a racetrack, but with a single deceptively simple truth about the world around us. Air has pressure, and where air moves faster, that pressure falls. It is a principle discovered centuries ago, a quiet piece of physics that governs how birds soar and how aeroplanes climb into the sky. But in the 1970s, a handful of brilliant engineers dared to ask a question that would change motor racing forever. What if you took the wing of an aircraft, the very thing that lifts a plane into the heavens, and turned it upside down? What if, instead of pushing a car up, you could use the air rushing beneath it to suck the whole machine down onto the tarmac harder and harder the faster it went? That question, as we shall see, would rewrite the rules of speed itself. The man who chased that question harder than anyone was Colin Chapman, the restless, obsessive founder of Team Lotus, a designer who saw the racing car not as a lump of metal, but as a problem in physics waiting to be solved. His engineers took to the wind tunnel, and there they made a curious discovery. By shaping the underside of the car like an upturned aircraft wing, narrow in the middle, opening out toward the rear, they could accelerate the air flowing beneath the floor, and as that air sped up, its pressure collapsed. Above the car, ordinary atmospheric pressure pushed down. Below it, a region of low pressure pulled hard toward the ground. The car was, quite literally, being sucked onto the track by the sky itself. The result was the Lotus 78, unveiled in 1977. A machine that could corner at speeds its rivals found simply impossible, gripping the road through invisible force alone. But there was a secret to it, a fragile and vital detail hidden along the edges of that floor, and everything depended on keeping it sealed. That secret was the seal, for the low pressure beneath the floor was a delicate thing, and it could only survive if the air trapped underneath was kept from leaking away at the sides. If ordinary atmospheric pressure crept in from the edges, the vacuum would collapse in an instant, and with it, all that precious grip. So Chapman's engineers devised a wonderfully simple answer: sliding skirts. Along each side of this car ran spring-loaded strips that reached down and brushed against the tarmac, closing off the underside like a curtain drawn tight against the road. With the floor sealed, the air beneath could be tamed completely, and the suction reached extraordinary strength. And in 1978 came the machine that perfected it all, the Lotus 79, a car so dominant, so glued to the ground, that its rivals could only watch it disappear into the distance. For a brief, glorious moment, Lotus had found something close to magic. But magic in motor racing always comes with a price. The price was this: the very force that made these cars so magnificent was also profoundly, unnervingly unstable. For as long as the skirts kept their seal against the road, the suction held firm, and the driver was pressed into the corner as though held by an unseen hand. But should the car strike a curb or ride over a bump, or should a skirt catch and jam for even a fraction of a second, the seal would break. And in that instant, the atmosphere would rush in beneath the floor, the vacuum would vanish, and every ounce of grip would disappear with it. One moment, the driver had all the downforce in the world. The next moment, nothing at all. No warning, no slow slide to correct, just a car that had, without notice, forgotten how to hold the road, often at the fastest, most punishing corner on the circuit. And so the sport now faced a terrible reckoning, because other teams had seen what Lotus had done, and they were determined to chase this invisible force even further, no matter the cost. By 1981, the whole grid had fallen under the spell of the underfloor, and the pursuit of downforce had become an obsession that swept away all caution. The cars grew stiffer, ever stiffer. For to keep the skirts pressed hard against the road, the suspension was tightened until it barely moved at all, until the springs were so unforgiving that the machines rode as though bolted directly to the tarmac. The drivers paid the price in their bodies, spines jarred, vision blurred, hands numbed by the relentless hammering of every bump transmitted straight through the chassis. Cornering speeds climbed to figures that had once seemed impossible, and the forces pulling at a driver's neck through a fast bend became almost unbearable. This was no longer merely fast, it was dangerous, brutally so. And the sport's governing body, watching the speeds rise and the risks mount, began to realize that this invisible force, if left unchecked, might one day claim more than it gave. And so the rule makers moved cautiously at first, hoping to tame what they could not quite understand. They banned the sliding skirts, those thin blades that had sealed the car to the road, believing that without them the vacuum beneath the floor would simply fade away. But the engineers were cleverer still. They found a way around the letter of the law, lowering their cars with ingenious hydraulic systems that dropped the chassis to the ground once out on track, then lifted it again for inspection in the pits. The seal returned, the suction returned, and with them, the danger returned in full. For a while it seemed this force could not be contained by words on a page, that every rule written to restrain it would simply be outwitted by the minds racing to exploit it. The reckoning, it turned out, had not yet arrived. It was still to come, and it would come at a price no one wished to pay. The reckoning came, as such things so often do, not in the calm of the drawing office but in the violence of the corner, for the terrible flaw in ground effect lay hidden in its very perfection. So long as the floor was sealed and the airflow beneath it flowed clean and true, the suction held firm, and the car gripped the road with a force that felt almost supernatural. But should that seal be broken, even for an instant, a curb clipped, a bump struck, the car pitched a fraction too high, the vacuum would collapse in the blink of an eye. And in that single heartbeat, all the invisible force that had pressed the car to the earth simply vanished, leaving a machine travelling at enormous speed with almost nothing holding it down. There was no warning, no gentle slide to be caught and corrected, just grip and then nothing at all. A driver could do everything right and still be flung from the road by physics he had no power to feel coming. And so, one by one, the tragedies mounted, each a stark warning written in twisted metal and broken hope. The sport had chased downforce to the very edge of what was survivable, and now it stood at that edge, looking down. By the early 1980s, the governing body understood at last that words alone would not be enough. They could not simply forbid the skirts and trust the engineers to obey the spirit of the rule, for the engineers would always find another door. So they did something far more drastic. They reached beneath the car itself and they changed the very shape of the floor. The flat bottom was coming, and with it, an era of ground effect would be brought, quite deliberately, to an end. The rule, when it came in 1983, was elegant in its simplicity. From the back of the front wheels to the front of the rear wheels, the underside of every car had to be perfectly, uncompromisingly flat. No more sculpted tunnels, no more Venturi channels carved to accelerate the air, no more sliding skirts sealing the vacuum to the ground. At a single stroke, the great suction that had defined an era was outlawed, and the invisible force was, for a time, banished from the sport. The engineers who had spent years learning to command the air beneath the car were sent back to the wing and to the body above it. But you cannot unteach a lesson so hard won, for they had glimpsed something extraordinary in those tunnels, a way to make the very ground work for them, and they would never truly forget it.